out because they need to kind of bridge the gap between my community-based work that I had done based on soccer and my wife's doctoral expertise through dentistry. So when we started, when I started G3, it was all based on the fact that getting kids to stay active, having them in good quality environments, and then inserting this health and wellness aspect that really because to do that, my company maintains a park in the Old Northeast. We also take care of Brookside soccer. And we also are looking to work with Parks and Rec to help add additional programming to kind of a lack of other programming that isn't out there for kids, specifically in the inner city. Brookside is a different animal since it's been around since 1977, and it is soccer only. We do know that kids out there need more activity. More than any time, I think, in this country's history, you have more obese kids. You have other ailments that are creating problems, not only at school but at home. And like I said, through my wife's dental profession, it kind of opened up my eyes to the reality that kids don't go to the dentist enough. They don't know how to floss. Parents don't know when maybe they're supposed to change the toothbrush. And a lot of different diseases show up in the mouth, because the mouth is the gateway to the body. Besides your mouth, I think the brain, I know the brain is probably the most important thing that your body has. And concussions have played an important role in my life and how it's affected me, both as a player, as a parent, and as a human being. And Dr. Rippee here tonight will speak to you about the significance of concussions, not only for athletes, but for kids, for people in general. And I think education is the piece here. And it doesn't matter how old you are. I see a little guy here sitting in the front row. I've got kids at home. I'm sure everybody else has a kid or knows somebody a little bit younger. And until you know the symptoms, you might not necessarily know what to look for. You might overlook things and think, oh, it's just a knock on the head, kind of like our fathers or our mothers and grandparents used to do. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Rippee up here to start the presentation. Sasha Victorine is on his way. I was kind of joking that maybe he forgot because he got hit in the head one too many times where this place was. But we'll introduce Sasha here when he gets here. So no further ado, Dr. Rippee. Thank you.
All right, so thanks for having me. A couple disclaimers at the front. I will try not to scare the bejesus out of you. But I've been accused before of being dark and gloomy, so that's not the intent here. The intent is to educate people so that when they are their loved ones, their kids, their colleagues' kids, whatever, the biggest thing is recognition, knowing what's going on, what the consequences are, so that you can avoid the bad outcomes. That's really kind of the goal that we get out and talk about concussion that we want to do is avoid the bad outcomes. So I'm one of the physicians, I'm a neurologist. I agree the brain is the most important piece of the body, and I'm a little biased, so because that's what I do. But so I'm a neurologist at the University of Kansas Hospital. I work in the Center for Concussion Management, which is our multidisciplinary group. There's a multitude of doctors, therapists, other physicians, and pretty much anything that might be needed for somebody with a concussion. Which is really kind of the goal when we created this about 2 years ago, so that if somebody has a concussion, they come in, they get evaluated by experts who know what they're doing in this, and that they can see whoever they need to see appropriately. So anyways, I will get started here. Again, I've also been accused of being boring, so I'll try to interject some fun stuff as we go along. Some of this is a little bit dry, but I kind of can't help it. So. Okay, so the first thing I always talk about is how many concussions really happen. This is from the Centers for Disease Control, and this is data from 2011, and they basically estimated almost 4 million concussions, 4 million sports and recreation-related concussions. So the key words for me in my practice is sports and recreation concussions. I mean, I see people who get hurt at work, I see people who get hurt in car accidents, and those aren't even in these numbers. So, I mean, we're talking about a large number of people who are suffering from concussions, not just from playing sports, which is kind of the hot topic right now. But I mean, this happens in everyday life. I have a patient who, this is why I don't do this anymore, fell off his ladder cleaning his gutters. So I now have somebody who does that for me. So I guess if they get a concussion at my house, they're in the right place. But, this is data from 2009. Emergency rooms saw 446,000 sports-related head injuries. So the thing I would say there is look at those first two numbers, 4 million and 500,000. So the vast majority of people who get concussions don't necessarily go to the emergency room. And again, part of that is just an education piece to the puzzle, but it's not the whole picture. We'll go through some of that. Ages 15 to 24, sports concussion is the second most common injury that is seen among patients 15 to 24. The other is trauma, which is usually related to falls and car accidents. So again, this is some data, and what it really is looking back from 1997 to 2007, and you'll see, unfortunately, a lot of the data here is older data, and the newer data is still kind of rolling in as we get more used to looking at this. But what you'll see is the green bars represent kids age 8 to 13. The blue bars are kids age 14 and 19. But what you'll notice essentially is, I don't know if I don't see it. Anyways, what you'll notice is that the trend is going up. We're seeing more and more diagnoses of concussions as we get further along in this. And especially in that blue bar, you can really see that one separate and go a little more quickly than the green bars. So approximately 8.9%, so about 9% of all high school athletic injuries are concussions. Okay, so almost 10% of every injury in a high school athletics event is a concussion. And honestly, that's probably underrepresented. College athlete injuries range from about 5 to 8%. You know, there's a lot of people who argue that younger children are at higher risk for concussion based on the fact that their brain is still developing, and as they age, that risk of concussion goes down. I would say that's probably a little bit true, but not 100% true. I mean, you can see if you use the top end on that on the college athletes, the difference between 9% and 8% is not a large difference. So why are concussions more frequent? I just showed you like a couple different slides of concussions are increasing. And really, my argument is that they're not increasing. We're getting better at recognizing it. I can't count how many patients I've had in clinic who come with their parents, and the dad's like, well, you know, I've had my bone 4 times, and I said, well, congratulations, you've had 4 concussions. And so we're getting better at kind of using our tools to diagnose this and recognize it. So concussion, in the old sense of the word, we talk to a lot of people. They say, well, if you didn't get knocked out, it wasn't a concussion. You know, they use the term "get your bell rung," I saw stars, and those kind of things. And so we're trying to evolve and kind of what that means, and really trying to say, look, those kinds of things, getting your bell rung, seeing stars, feeling woozy, so there's more awareness. We have events like this. You know, 15 years ago, I don't think anybody was having an event out in town talking about concussions. Clearly, there's more media attention, as evidenced by news stories this morning. There's news articles almost every day. Somebody emails me some kind of article about something related to concussion, whether it's a study, a new injury, a bad outcome, whatever the case may be. And then a better understanding, as we've started to kind of wrap our head around this and recognize that it's an issue, there's a lot more research, a lot more understanding of what is happening and what to do about it. So which sport ranks the highest? Anyone want to guess? They are not necessarily listed in a specific order. Cheerleading. Cheerleading is not the highest. There's actually I did list it. Okay, good. I started to say I forgot to list the highest one. Anybody else? Gymnastics, no. Lacrosse is up there. Go for it. Football. Football is the number, actually on this list, football is number 2. If you want to just take purely sports, football is number 1. Cycling. I can't count how many people I have with bicycle accidents in my clinic. I mean, hands down, probably right up there with football if you want to, depending on how you parse the numbers, but cycling and football swamp the rest of them. Okay, so actually let me go through here. Baseball, clearly, they're trying to outlaw the top picture there. So, basketball, soccer, clearly you can get a concussion playing soccer. I think we have a couple experts over here that will tell you that. Hockey, swimming, gymnastics, cheerleading is actually quite a ways up there, especially in adolescent girls. They take a lot of injuries. And gymnastics. And then I listed a couple of power recreational vehicles, motorcycles, ATVs, those kinds of things. Let's see. So this is a graph of what we were just talking about. And you can see football is far and away the number one. Unfortunately, cycling is not listed on this graph. I could not, for the life of me, find a good graph that had everything I wanted on it. So I just said this is the best one, and I like it. But you see football, basketball, soccer's number 3, baseball, swimming, hockey. If you go down, there's a miscellaneous volumes, whatever that means. It's a little bit higher. This is so the new way. One of the new ways people really start talking about concussions and the risk is this rate of athletic exposures. So one practice is an athlete exposure, one game is an athlete exposure, one workout is an athlete exposure. So you can imagine if you've got a football team of 50 kids, one practice is 50 athlete exposures. So that's kind of how they come up with some of these numbers in this particular graph. And what they looked at is what's the rate of injury for these particular events. You can see this one kind of flipped over, but football's at the bottom, which is number 1, across women's ice hockey, men's ice hockey, and women's soccer. For some reason, the women tend to be a little higher risk, especially the teenage girls. They tend to be a little higher risk of suffering a concussion than a teenage boy. And so you can see the list kind of goes on. And so they're starting to become these classifications of what's a contact sport, and I kind of say, well, almost everything. I mean, I've had people try to tell me soccer is not a contact sport. I think that's, basketball is not a contact sport. I play basketball, trust me, it is a contact sport. So, but we try to classify these as like high rates of contact collisions. So like football, boxing. What's the definition of boxing? Concuss your opponent, right? That is the definition of boxing. So you kind of classify these in layers of risk. So you see to the left are kind of more impactful boxing, field hockey, football, rodeo. Rodeo's big. It reaches a lot of rodeo athletes. They're getting knocked off and falling on their heads and those kind of things. So you kind of work your way down into the quote-unquote non-impact sports. I'm trying to remember what this graph is. It's this. Oh, so this is for high school athletes, and you can see there again. Boys ice hockey. How they didn't get football on this graph, I don't know. Follow them at the top. What the author of this one is trying to say is if you look at girls lacrosse and boys lacrosse, the boys have to wear helmets and the girls don't. Again, I don't know how that works and who came up with that rule. But you can see there that so girls lacrosse actually had a pretty high rate of injury. Really, what it really boils down to is the higher rate of contact, the higher risk of concussion. Okay, so the less contact, the less likely you are to get a concussion. I suppose if you're bowling and you slip and fall, you could get a concussion. Okay, so what's a concussion? Anybody want to take a stab? No? All right, that's why I'm here, right? Okay, so some people say a concussion is, I know it when I see it. I can tell you that's a concussion and that's not. And they're not exactly wrong. And sometimes I kind of subscribe to that theory. But, a concussion, really, if you want to break it down simply, it's a type of brain injury that changes the way the brain works. That's probably, honestly, the most basic and pure form of what a concussion is. Okay? It's caused by some kind of bump, blow, jolt, change in direction that causes the head to move in a direction it wasn't supposed to. People are calling these all kinds of different names. Concussion is kind of the old term. there's a movement in the medical community to get away from that term and call it mild traumatic brain injury, just to try to give it some importance behind it. When you say traumatic brain injury, sometimes people perk up a little bit. I don't know. Mild brain trauma, mild closed head trauma, minor head trauma. Really the goal is in that awareness and education, trying to put some emphasis on it. That this is a brain injury that's occurring, and to take it a little more seriously. So, a little background. This is the part of a boring slide. Okay, so the Zurich conference. This was a conference back in 2008 where all the world leaders in concussion met in Switzerland and tried to come up with all these guidelines and definitions and to guide the treatment of concussion. This is what they came up with. Concussion is designed as a complex pathophysiological process affecting the brain induced by traumatic biochemical forces. Even I'm going, okay, sure, whatever you say. I like this one better. If you take the word concussion and break it down into where its origins, it came from the Latin definition of two different words: to shake violently and the action of striking together. That sounds pretty accurate, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know why we can't just leave it that simple and say that's pretty much what it is. So, a concussion is basically a violent shaking, violent jarring that results in brain function disturbance. Okay? This is one of my favorite pictures. I love this picture. This pretty much boils it right down. This guy is very exuberant about whatever he's answering yes to. But I like this one, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but what I like is if you watch those little flashy red lights when the brain hits the skull, that's really where the injury occurs. And so we'll talk a little bit more later on about helmets and what they mean and do they protect or not protect and how so. So the injury actually occurs from the brain, which is stuck inside of a hard box, hitting the inside of that box. Okay? So we'll come back to that. I gotta get through the boring stuff first before we talk about some of the fun stuff. But it can occur from rotational. If you really think about boxing as a good example, because like I said, the goal is to concuss your opponent. Think about the guy who comes around with the big haymaker and snaps the guy's head around, and you can literally see the lights go off. So you can get him from that rotational force too. It's not just that straight on, knocking heads or something like that. Okay. While this may not be the funnest is not a word, while this may not be the most fun part of the talk, this is probably the take-home piece, especially for parents, coaches, referees, athletes. I don't know what we've got kind of in the mix of the crowd here, but this is kind of the take-home that you think about as we go forward. So, I like to break this down. This slide is really what are the symptoms and complaints that somebody who's got a concussion is going to have. Okay, and you can see the list is kind of long, and sometimes it's a little vague. I actually tell some patients who come in, we have this symptom checklist they fill out, and I tell them, there's days where if I don't get enough sleep at night because my kids were awake or whatever, that I could probably score a couple points on this checklist. So, but anyways, where you see headaches, nausea, vomiting, balance problems, dizziness, confusion, concentration, memory problems, blurred vision, double vision, sensitivity to light or noise, they feel sluggish, hazy, foggy, they're more emotional, nervous, or anxious, they don't feel right, they feel detached, they're numb to their surroundings, they lose consciousness, or they're groggy. Okay? In reality, what you want to look for, because the kid's not going to walk off and go, I feel detached from my surroundings, right? They're not going to get up off the ground and say that. So as a parent, coach, athlete, referee, someone who's sitting in the stands, what you want to look for is that bell rung or they appear dazed, that kind of glassy look in their eye. They're confused about the plays. They don't know what's going on. You're like, we run this play all the time. And they're often doing something not right. They come to the sideline and say, what's the score? And they're like, who are we playing? That kind of thing. One of my favorite, so I'll tell a joke here. One of my favorite jokes. This is a joke one of my colleagues told me. He was in clinic seeing patients, and he had 3 football players, one from MU, one from KU, one from K-State. This is an equal opportunity joke here. And he said he looked at the KU player. They're all there for concussions. He looked at the KU player and said, "What day of the week?" He said, "It's purple." Thanks, you got a concussion. And he looked at the K-State player and he said, "What day of the week is it?" He said, 42. congratulations, you have a concussion. He looked at the zoo football player and he said, by the way, I'm a zoo fan, which is why I said zoo. So. But anyways, he looks at that football player and he says, what day of the week is it? And he said, Wednesday. He goes, hey, good job, how'd you get that? And he goes, I added purple to Anyway, so again, it's kind of that confusion about where they're at, what's going on. They can't recall what happened. They can't follow instructions, which a lot of teenagers can't follow instructions, so you have to take that into account. They answer questions slowly, they're clumsy. If they lose consciousness, obviously, that's kind of the one that most people will see. There was something else I was going to say, I forgot. Oh, I have to tell another story, that's what it was. So this is a guilty as charged story. This happened when I was a resident. My wife was a teacher at a local high school. We were at a basketball game, watching the game. We're sitting there, and I see this kid take a hard hit. He goes down to the floor, he gets up, and he's kind of doing this. And like 3 seconds later, I'm like, hey, he's got a concussion. And he's at the free throw line, shaking his head, and asking his teammates what's going on. He's got a concussion. Meanwhile, I didn't realize at the time my wife was like, that's his mom sitting right next to you. I'm like, okay. So I actually didn't say anything. And actually, this kid was the coach's son, who is sitting there, telling him what to do. And after the game, he walks up and starts talking to his mom. He's like, I don't remember half the game. He's like, I don't remember the whole second half of the basketball game. And I'm like, he's got a concussion. Anyway, to this day, I actually still don't know whether anything was ever said to the parents. I'm so guilty as charged, I didn't actually say anything. So the reason I tell that story is what I encourage. If you're sitting there and you're going, my teammate's son, or my teammate's daughter, or the opponent, I mean, God forbid I know it's the opponent, but that kid looks like they have a concussion. I would encourage you to say something to somebody, whether it's the coach, if there's a trainer there. I don't know if they have physicians on the sidelines or anything like that, but what I would encourage is if you don't see somebody recognize it, I would encourage you to say something. So, anyway, that's my personal experience. The problem is the initial hit's not necessarily the end of the story. It's sometimes only the tip of the iceberg. And while the athlete may get up and reasonably feel pretty good within 5 or 10 minutes, we know that over the course of the first 72 hours, things can change. And so I have a lot of patients that I felt pretty good the first night. Some patients who felt really terrible the first night, but then they say the next day I felt awful. I had a really bad headache and it's dizzy. So we know that there's some changes that go on there. All right, that's what I was talking about. So this is the boring medical piece that I couldn't help but put in because I'm a geek. And I find it interesting. You're probably going to sleep through the next couple slides, but this is what I found fun. So we know there's changes in the brain. So the big things, we know there's metabolic changes, which is really kind of what we think drives all symptoms. We know there's alterations in these things called glutamate, potassium, and calcium. I'll go through this a little bit in nauseating detail. But there's a decrease in blood supply to the brain. There's a mismatch in supply and demand, so there's not enough energy going to the brain, so the brain can't function the way it needs to. There's nerve cells that dysfunction, and there's an increased vulnerability to a second injury. So as I go through these, we'll talk about it. So this is a slide, this is an old slide, but this is kind of the Bible of medical changes. It's a really point. What you see happen is these wild shifts in calcium and potassium. The blue line on the bottom there is cerebral blood flow, so that goes down. And you can see this is in the first 30 minutes and then up to hours and even out to days. So if you go all the way out to the end of the graph, it's 10 days later and you're still having changes in their glucose, which is the main energy source, and their blood flow, which is what carries the main energy source. So you can see here that even after 10 days, there's big changes. So these are, I'm really proud of these, by the way. I had to draw these because all the ones I looked up are copyrighted, so the cells are real. I just looked at that picture, but everything else is there. So these are nerve cells, okay, neurons, and you can see them kind of all interchange there and talking to each other. What happens after a hit to the head that is sufficient to cause a concussion is that you get this shift of potassium out of the cell. Okay, so all the potassium that should be in the cells shifts outward. What also happens is all the calcium that's outside of the cells shifts into the cells. So you're already starting, these two, calcium and potassium are very important for conduction of the nerve impulse. So already you're getting these large shifts that cause the cell to be unable to send its message. At the same time, you have these neurotransmitters, which are what actually, so at the end of every nerve cell, there's actually a little gap. And as the impulse comes down, the neurotransmitter gets released and causes the next cell to send its signal on. And so you get this big release of neurotransmitters, which is what the glutamate is. And all of a sudden, the cells are out of their way to communicate with each other. So they can't create an impulse, and what they use to communicate with each other is now exhausted. In the meantime, the cell is trying to correct that. And so they have these little yellow globules that are essentially transporters. And it's like for every calcium out, you get a potassium in. But to do that, they have to expend energy, which means glucose. So now you're expending all the energy trying to recreate the ability to send your message. Okay? What's really hard to see up there is there's these little brown ovals. Those are a piece of the cell called mitochondria. It's the factory. It's like the registry here. These are the pieces of the cell that make the energy. They take the glucose, turn it into the pieces of the energy that the cell uses. Okay. What happens is the calcium that was all supposed to be outside rushes in, gets stuck to that, and basically glues up the factory. So you can't use the glucose. You can't make the energy. You can see all the ways that the nerves talk and send their messages are basically screwed up. So what happens is when they're in this state of, so the cell's not dead, it can't do its job. It's really susceptible to another injury. So this is where we get worried, especially in the initial phase, is that if you've got a cell that's in this phase, it's really at risk and really vulnerable to another injury. So I call this energy crisis. The cell doesn't have the energy it needs to do what it's supposed to and function the way it's supposed to. There's impaired communication, decreased blood flow, and the cell walls are damaged. Okay, everybody's extremely bored, right? Okay. I don't know if I have a way to play this. Is there a clicker somewhere? Let me see if I can. There we go. I don't know if there's any sound. We'll find out.
If you have a blow to the head, that's sufficient enough to cause the brain to move inside the skull. A certain neurochemical called potassium is released outside of the neuron. At the same time, a second neurochemical called calcium, which is supposed to be outside the cell, it leaks into the neuron. And for some reason, a second blow during this period of metabolic crisis will set off a cascade of events that you can't turn back from. And that's when you see the massive brain swelling.
Okay, everybody's sufficiently scared to death. That was Mickey Collins. He's kind of one of the gurus. He's at the University of Pittsburgh. And he's kind of one of the pioneers of some concussion stuff. I'll show you some of his stuff later. Okay, so second impact syndrome. This is the piece that scares the bejesus out of me, and why most people are really, 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 really cautious about concussion. So what happens is it occurs when there's a second head injury. It can be minor, a minor injury. That happens before the symptoms associated with the first head injury have resolved. So essentially, that cell I just showed you that's not working, if it's not repaired, then there's a risk for this second impact syndrome. It can lead to massive brain swelling, which can lead to permanent brain damage and death. And these don't have to be severe concussions. Let me see if I can tell the story.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said when the cells are repaired, it's just a matter of time?
Yeah, it's mostly a matter of time. And I'll go a little bit through that later. But yeah, it's mostly time. And if there's questions, stop me. I'll definitely take questions at the end for sure. So I don't mind if you want to ask a question, just interrupt. I'm used to it. I have two kids. I'm used to it. So second impact syndrome was actually first described back in 1973. It was first termed as second impact syndrome of catastrophic head injury, which I can't even say now, so I can't say on 2 patients. And advice that it occurs when there's a second injury after the first injury, before it's resolved. So really what we worry about is returning to play too soon. Boy, I hope we did everything in these slides. It's a rare condition. Depending on where you read it, there's only a handful of cases. Some people will say there's more, some people will say there's less. The presentation on the field, if you're really concerned about this, would be somebody who's unconscious, they have neurologic changes, they have what we call pulmonary edema, and then hopefully someone would know there's a history of a recent concussion. Okay, I want to make sure. So, does anybody know who this is? Probably not. This is Nathan Stiles. He was a high school football player at Spring Hill. And in 2011, I think, I forget the year now, he suffered a concussion. I mean, this is like the star football player of the team. Suffered a concussion. Was set out for essentially 2 weeks, but it wasn't. If you look at everything, it was actually probably cleared appropriately, but actually in hindsight, probably wasn't completely healed up. Was playing in the football game. Took a couple of what looked like small hits, and later on in the game, passed out, went unconscious, and unfortunately died later that night. And so, Nathan was actually kind of the inspiration to start our concussion center. There were a lot of physicians who were still involved there that were involved in his case that said something needs to be done to make sure that, if we can, make sure that this doesn't happen again. So. That's Nathan's story. So we like to tell Nathan's story when we go out in the public if we can, if the opportunity. Anyways, okay. So moving past that, so what should be done on the sideline when something when you're concerned about a concussion? Anybody coaches here? Anybody coaches? Okay, so a couple coaches. Anybody trainers or so a couple. Okay. So these are kind of the tips I give because trust me, I don't want to be on the sideline of every game. As much as I love the Chiefs, I'd love to be their sideline physician until it's December and it's like 0 degrees outside and nothing happens for 3 hours and you check out in the snow. So the most important thing is recognition, which is really kind of the whole point of going out and doing education, is that you want people to recognize what a concussion is. Because if you don't recognize it, the rest of this doesn't matter. So, I need to update this slide. There's what's called the sideline concussion assessment tool. This is the SCAT-2. This was they just revised this 6 months to a year ago. So there's a SCAT-3. You can get pocket cards. You can get it's on your apps for your phones, your droids, your iPads. This is what most people will use on the sideline. There's other tools. This is probably the most widely used and widely accepted. And so it's really small. You can see if you ask them, there's lots of consciousness, pressure in the head. And you give them some memory tests. Where are we playing today? What half is it? Did your team win the last game? This is one of my favorite commercials of all time. This was ever before I even got interested in concussion. There's an old Snickers commercial where the football player gets injured. They all run out on the field, and they say, "Tell me your name," and the guy goes, "I'm Batman." I just roll on the floor, and they're like, "He's going," And so then it was their old motto of not going anywhere for a while, and he's eating Snickers on the sideline. I can't find the commercial, otherwise I would have it in my slides. That's one of my favorite. So whose responsibility is this? And this goes back a little bit to the story I was telling from a sideline perspective. Whose responsibility is it to recognize this? And I would basically say anybody that's at the event in reality. Whether it's a coach, a trainer, a referee. Sometimes there's emergency medical services, especially at some of the high school football games. The parents, the teammates, the friends. So when I talk to kids, what I encourage them is, look, if somebody gets hurt, especially if it's your teammate, but even if it's one of the opponents, if you don't want to feel comfortable telling your coach, tell the official, just somebody that should be kind of in charge and hopefully do the appropriate thing. The important thing is they don't get to go back to play, so they're done for the rest of the game, which is the hardest part to, especially when the kid goes, "I feel fine," and you can go, "Sorry, you're done." But that's really what should happen, is that if you suspect a concussion, they should be done. Because what you don't want is to put the kid back in and they end up in that bad situation where they take another hit and then end up with really serious damage. So this is an example of a sideline assessment. Just kind of watch the screen.
Starting with October, I was going to say the months of the year, backwards,
June.
How many of you could do that right now? Starting with November. This is a hard test. I can do it right now, but that's part of the assessment. And you can kind of see him, even the whole time he's kind of wandering, his eyes are kind of wandering around. Maybe that's because he's at football. So for the coaches especially, this is what you want to do if you suspect a concussion. Okay? If you suspect a concussion, take them out of the game. As hard as I don't care, I know, especially if it's your best player, you want to send them back in, but the right thing to do is take them out of the game. You want to refer them to some kind of medical professional. I would love if you referred to me, but I don't really care as long as you send them to somebody who knows what they're doing and can evaluate the athlete. You want to tell the parent. That seems kind of like a no-brainer, but I've seen kids that had a concussion, and the parent goes, I didn't even figure it out 3 days later when they said, I got this really nasty headache, and I got hit 3 days ago during the game. Don't let them drive home. Don't let them drive home, please, because the last thing you want is something to happen when they get dizzy or they pass out or something like that. And then don't return them to practice or play until they get cleared by a professional, a medical professional. So this is what the Vikings did when they were talking about concussions. We'll take a break there and get some coffee or ask questions. Or I have more. So if you're bored, I have more. If you're excited, I have more. Yeah.
Got one nerdy question.
Yeah, go for it. I love nerdy questions.
For treatment,
Yeah.
do you give like big agonists to increase
You need to come down and help us get a research grant. Right now, no. That's where all the research is at. What do we do for this? We're starting to get a good idea of I can show you pictures of the neuron and tell you what's happening, but we have no clue how to treat it right now. There's lots of theories. There's lots of money being spent on this. Lots. The NFL, the Department of Defense, you name it. There's millions and millions of dollars being spent on this research right now.
I think with that, my brother's a psychiatrist, and the advances with arm devices.
With what?
With like an arm device.
Yeah. Yeah.
Incredible. He said some incredibly nasty rats.
Yeah.
I mean, he wants sort of.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
How much is like the sporting organization working with that and working? Kind of costing that research.
I don't know how much each entity is working across itself. The NFL is, and they're the biggest one in the news, and it's partly because of the lawsuits, but they've been spending a lot of money, and they're working with the National Institutes of Health and trying to funnel that money towards research that I think is going to be really helpful. The NFL is doing its own research, but then they want to fund other researchers. And kind of each entity is doing, I mean, if you look at baseball, they've got all these guys doing research on the helmets and the hats and those kind of things, but how much they're all talking to each other, I don't actually know the answer to that.
Doesn't seem like they're going on.
I don't think they are. I can't prove that or disprove that. Yeah.
You might talk about this later too, but you talk about whether it takes an actual blow to the head to cause concussion or it takes a blow to the body to cause the head.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I have that in there, otherwise I wouldn't steal my thunder. So, yeah, actually, I have a lot of patients, especially the car accident patients, that you talk to them and they got rear-ended and they didn't really necessarily hit the headrest or the steering wheel, but by God, I mean, that picture I showed you where the head's just walking like this, yeah, it does not have to be an actual head-to-head blow if they get hit really hard and their head changes. So what you really want to think about, this is a physics geek too, so if you think about somebody who's going this, going at a certain direction at, say, 30 miles an hour, and for whatever reason they meet some force that causes them to either stop or switch direction. the brain is still going 30 miles an hour and slams into the skull at 30 miles an hour. And so it does not have to be that head-to-head that's the most common, but that can be kind of injury that really causes that either rotational or quick shift in direction. Yeah.
Sorry.
Go for it.
This may relate to parents kind of after, but I saw a documentary kind of when they had some patients, I guess, that after they had a car wreck or a strong injury, and there was a load split in the skull, they had long-term injury. Are those things able to be treated with medication?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes. So the problem usually with those patients is that there's an injury to a specific part of the brain which is in charge of emotions. And so sometimes you can't get around that. Sometimes you can try to dampen it a little bit, but not necessarily get all there.
So that doesn't follow on.
What's that?
That doesn't keep in contact.
Yeah. All right, let's take a break. I'll answer more questions as we go along.
Yeah. Okay, so let Dr. Rippee kind of take a little bit of a break, recharge his battery. But I'd like to introduce Sasha Victorine. Sasha, I've known, should I take to go back probably to our college days, pre-lives, and well, I guess we were probably dating at the time. So Sasha went to UCLA. Our evil nemesis when I was at Indiana University. He still won 3 national championships. This guy and his team stole 1 from me. So to this day, he's the reason why I hate UCLA. But nonetheless, he's been a great teammate, a great guy. He and his family transplanted here after Sasha's stint there at the LA Galaxy. Played here for a bit and then moved around. And his career was cut short because of concussions. So I've invited Sasha to come and speak tonight to maybe share a little bit of his story and what he's dealt with. I don't know how much he can talk about and kind of some of the final stuff, because Sasha did go or has gone through some litigation with Major League Soccer on a career-ending settlement. So I'll leave the stage here for him to speak about his path and concussions and really why he had to cut his unfortunate great career short. So without further ado, Dr. Victorine.
Thanks for the introduction, Nick. Super warm, hardcore, I can see. Thanks everybody for coming out. I know if you want to get water, get a break. This is really important from my standpoint. I will say I'm not going to be as good as the doctor who's got his whole presentation together. So I thought what I could hopefully do for you guys is just share a little bit of the direction around my experience, what it's like to go through some of the treatment and things kind of on the back end, as well as some of the things that I've done now that I've been in my career and some of the things that I've gotten to in helping kind of the progression I think we've seen in doctors doing here, trying to figure out better ways to kind of go through 3 stages. Things I'll talk about today is, I think there's 3 pieces to this that really the research everybody is going after. It's prevention, right, diagnosis, and the treatment. I think all 3 of those, we go through the concussions sector or whatever of healthcare. All 3 of those, I think, are limited right now and actually have a true result that you guys probably can take home on your papers or whatever and feel like you could help your kids or anybody who's in that situation. I think those are all areas that the NFL, Major League Soccer, Major League Baseball, everybody's certainly racing towards trying to figure out answers to. But there's not really a great answer to any individual. And I'll take you through some of my experiences. Happy to ask questions with you, and then I probably have a few questions in the document too. Just a little bit of my background. I played professionally in Major League Soccer from 2000 to 2009. I said in 2009 I sustained the last concussion in my career and retired in 2010. I'll get a little bit of the story in 2009 what happened, but I think it's worthwhile for me to go back to my first concussion that I can remember. The first time I had a concussion was back when I was about 16 years old in high school. I remember doing the old follow the line, follow my finger stuff. Didn't really think too much about it until I got to college. First year in college, I was playing a game at the University of Washington in Seattle when I was playing at UCLA. When I went up to Seattle, played in a pretty rigorous game. I think we were number 2 or 3 in the country. And it was still like 10 or 15 inches. Yeah, sure. But the game was pretty heated, and in that game I was a freshman, and ended up taking a head injury towards the very end of the game. And it actually happened one of the first games of my career. I was playing in Indiana, 3 games in the season, I dislocated my shoulder. And so I was playing that year with a dislocated shoulder. I went up for a header, and I ended up getting knocked kind of sideways. And my feet cut underneath me and just landed straight on my back, and hit my head straight to the ground. And I didn't know if I had a concussion. I didn't know anything other than the fact that my shoulder hurt, my head hurt. And so I saw the doctor. Fortunately, the college game, much different than when I was in high school. There's doctors there, physicians who can actually treat you. So I saw the doctor immediately after the game, and our team actually flew home that night. It was a day game, and I stayed behind. And I don't know if this is something you talk about. I didn't see it here, but they talked about not traveling in the air and stuff immediately after concussion in case of probably blood flow and other things that were going on. But so I ended up staying the night for an extra night, getting checked out the next day by the doctor, and flying home the next day. So through my college career, I'm very fortunate. Probably didn't have any concussions outside that. In professional ranks, I had about 2 or 3 more concussions that I could diagnose or know about. The last concussion that I got in 2009 was really strange because it wasn't, if I think about it, it wasn't the most dramatic, impactful hit that I've received. But it was very unique because it was something that was unexpected. I'll kind of take you through the play itself. We were in training, and we kick out of this because we use all the time. I was playing like 5v5 in training because it's a great way to kind of recreate a game in a smaller environment. And in that game, we had on my team a goalkeeper who wasn't our normal goalkeeper. He was actually one of the youth academy players that we brought in as a backup because we need 4 goalies to be able to play 2 different games. And typically we carry 3 goalkeepers on the team. So this goalkeeper was there, and we were defending, and there was a shot. He just caught it. Simple routine save, and I was standing maybe 5 feet in front of him. And so I turned around away from the goalkeeper, so my back of my head was to him. And he takes the ball, and we're up back of the walls where the other goal is. He sees one of our forwards up by the goal, and just rears back and throws it as hard as he can, and hits me right in the back of the head. And my momentum didn't take me to the ground, it almost took me to the ground, so I was kind of basically hit down here. And as at that point, obviously didn't feel right. I continued to actually train. Training was basically over, but I continued to train and run around a little bit just to get right. And so as we were cooling down, I kind of stepped out and talked to the doctor, and so our trainer, so he just kind of had to sit down. And at that point, I think one of the first slides when I walked in, you had all the symptoms that were on there. Through the course of the next 2 days, every single one of those symptoms I felt. And I think what was weird is very difficult to identify certain pieces of them, but when back after you recognize it, it's hard at that moment to truly understand what's going on. I think part of me at that time knew, because I've had other concussions, kind of what the symptoms and things were, but this one was really weird. And the reason why was I felt the grogginess, the susceptibility to light, everything was super bright, and everything went from full point of view to full point of view to felt like everything was stretched out and shrunk down. So my perception of the world was just in this kind of view. And so as I was going through that for that day, I went back to the trainer's room, I got my treatment, and I went over to the team doctor who took a look at me. So this was probably all within the first 4 or 5 hours. Team doctor took a look at me. He said, it looks like you probably got a concussion. We'll just monitor you. Obviously, you're out for training tomorrow. So I went home that day, came back the next day, same symptoms, started to get a little bit worse in certain things, especially nausea and dizziness. Went home, the next day came back out, it felt like I started feeling maybe a little bit better. And so they actually had me take, I'll do a little bit of history on this, they had me take a test in 2005, I don't know if you remember this or not, but 2005 Major League Soccer created a new test that they basically created a baseline for all athletes in Major League Soccer around for concussions, what their baseline assessment was in this, I don't remember what the program is. Basically what it was is you sit in front of a computer screen, this is before your injury, so that they have a baseline on you, and they'll pull up images or words or whatever it is, and so they'll put up like 10 words slowly and let you see them. And then after that, you're trying to memorize those 10 words, and then after that, they put a bunch of different words one at a time, really quick up, so that you can see it, and you have to say it's out of word that was there. And you do that process. Additionally, there's another one that has like a bunch of squiggly lines and designs, and you get a bunch of those pictures, and you try to memorize them and tell you, okay, I'll run those by you again, those additional ones, and see if those are ones that you remember. And the test is basically doing two things. One, it's testing memory, and it's testing speed for how quickly you respond, yes or no. I actually saw that, and that's what happened. So everybody in the league goes through that baseline test. I'd actually gone through that baseline test twice. I came up 2 days after the fact and sat down in that room to go through my baseline test. And at the end of that, I get that back report that I passed. Missed like variances, very good. I'm great, I should go, doctor should clear me, I should be back in the field the next day. That night, I was in the emergency room, vomiting and extreme dizziness. I'm just completely almost out of it. And so it's strange, as you look through this, I think a lot of people say diagnosis is the most important thing. I think you're absolutely right, diagnosis is the most important thing. It's also the most difficult thing to figure out. And so, I don't want to scare people about this, that's not what I'm trying to do, but I think it's one of the most difficult things to understand how you identify if someone has a concussion, the symptoms, when they're ready to go back and play. And I think, one of the greatest things I think you did say today when I was listening is that the first step is, if you think there's potential for a concussion, is just take that person out and just give them a chance to get real evaluation and identification of whether or not it truly was a good thing. It's probably not worth the risk for them to their life. I'll open it up for questions. I could probably tell stories all day, but there's lots of different things. One thing I will say before I go is I actually coached playing professionally right now. Sit on the scientific advisory board for a foundation called the Cactus Foundation. Basically focused on those three areas that I talked about: prevention, diagnosis, and treatment for concussions and other health issues. But a lot of different research that we have seen, things that we have started looking at, like putting on dogs with glasses that start to look at how eye movement works. And Doctor, I don't know if you've heard these things before. A lot of the things that they do, obviously, with the fingers and watching it, is that they're trying to identify your retina and your eye movements so that if you're in the dark and you don't see anything, they can see that sometimes maybe your eye movements are not in parallel or synchronized.
Yeah, you did better than I will.
Again, so there's so many different things that are out there that they're working on. I think what the goal is, a lot of these foundations that I work with, is trying to find ways where we can get someone who knows nothing about a concussion to walk in to a kid who just suffered some sort of injury and diagnose right there on the field and at that location without having to have a medical professional, at that moment to help. There's so many different games. I mean, if you walk around the city and you hear so many different games, just like good games for basketball, football, something to take place. Very difficult for doctors and healthcare professionals to be able to help. So, love to open up for questions. I don't know if anybody has anything that they want to ask me, but happy to answer some questions. Yeah.
I have a question for both you guys. Let's say there's been some sort of head injury or a bump, and you're being super conservative. I'll use my 12-year-old son for example. We're conservative and we're keeping him out of any sort of athletics for, say, 10 days. It's one thing to risk another injury, but as it is doing other activity where they're not at risk. Let's say you don't think they're at risk for another injury, but they're running around, their heart rate's up and all that. Is that worse than the situation in that sort of delicate time period?
Yeah, I'll take first stab. Probably difficult to tell. I mean, I think one of the things I learned after my last concussion was I took 2 weeks off and did nothing, and tried to just see if things would come back, and nothing seemed to change. So I started going through a small routine with physical therapists, trying to start to increase my heart rate and do some things. And I got to a point where if I had my heart rate at a level, I remember a certain level, it was pretty good and things felt all right. I started to cross a higher level, and that's when I got into a lot of issues. So what I started to learn off the bat was on my recovery was a little bit of heart rate and trying to get a little bit of movement and stuff. Actually, from my personal perspective, worked this fine. I got to a lot more intensive work trying to increase my heart rate, like walking faster on the treadmill and stuff like that. Is where I started to get a lot more issues. I don't know if that's.
I don't know why you guys have been talking. That's pretty much it. Yeah, I mean, usually what I recommend is take it easy. I'll focus a go around the backyard. Even things like a move. I mean, you were talking about the eye movements. A kid sitting in front of a screen, and times bigger than just watching a movie or really upset. So there's lots of things, and especially the activity. I have a lot of patients that say, at rest, I feel okay. I still have a little bit of headache here. When I get back out on the field, there's that certain wall that everybody's wall is a little bit different. Which is what makes it tricky.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, it's so hard to tell. There's so many different symptoms on it. What I found out my issue, the reason why I ended up at the emergency, I think part of the issue was when I went home and relaxed and I was watching television, and all the movement and everything just on just watching totally set me off, dizziness, nausea, and I was done for days. So the things that you don't even think about, right? You just do as a normal routine, but you don't realize that just the movements and some of those things just take off and just brains aren't used to process it.
So I haven't heard you say this, I think I know the answer, but I mean, does the medical community recommend that you take your child or anybody to the doctor with any suggestion of a concussion every time?
Yeah, although I have a little bit about that. I mean, there's actually, especially for athletes, there's state laws about that.
Have you been released?
Officially, have been released about 5 months ago. And that's when I started to kind of get back into actual physical activity, jogging and stuff. Part of the things that I worked through were getting to the point to so back to what I said before, when I got over a certain heart rate, my head, dizziness, nausea, and everything came back. It took me 4.5 years to get to the point where I could jog. So I just got back about 6 months ago. I'm much better now than I was. I still have issues and things that come up, but overall, I significantly better. That's probably 6.5 months ago. But it took a process. What I learned was it wasn't like you could just all of a sudden sit and do nothing and be stagnant for 4 years, and then all of a sudden say, hey, one day I'm just going to run. It was some progress to try to okay, today I'm going to just walk faster, and then I'm not going to do anything for 3 days, see how I react, and then slowly. I felt like that is how I started feeling better and trying to get my body trained to get back to it.
I don't listen to anything
To prevent? No, I mean, MLS, per se, sports leagues don't really care after that. I mean, they're not looking for it. No, there are a bunch of different programs in MLS. We're working with them on a couple of organizations to try to get implemented. There's things like referee evaluations to make sure referees understand what they should be doing. There's a big push on trying to get referees to be the ones who decide that kids should not go back in the game, so they should take that pressure away from coaches, players, and everybody else. People think about looking at coaches. Some coaches have just as much incentive for them to have players playing. And these kids, especially certain ages, want to get back in. You think about it with your kids, right? As you grew up, think about it with your kids playing, right? You guys might be like, hey, I want to play, right? The coach is basically the one who's going to make the decision on this. So the question is the coach the one who's set to make the decision, or should the referee make the decision? So there's again, you start looking at diagnosis, prevention, and all those different things. I think there's so many different people who come into the picture of this stuff. And it's not just educating one person. I think everybody has to make it. Yeah.
Question for both of you around readiness to resume physical activity and game practice training and so forth. You have two stories to share tonight. One about the football player. You look back that by all accounts seemingly was cleared correctly. Your story, you went through baseline tests, seemingly was clear, yet then symptoms resumed. Is how exact or relatively inexact is the clearing process, especially for younger children, where I know high schools are now starting to adopt baseline testing, at some high schools anyway. But for, let's say, a 9 or 10-year-old, that previous test doesn't exist. So how exact or inexact is that process of clearing the athlete?
It's inexact. It's more exact than it was. I think, so what Sasha was talking about was, I think you were talking about the impact test, most likely, the way you described it. I've taken it, I've never had a concussion, that test is hard to tell. I mean, my God. But I think, and I think I have this in the slide later, the important piece, so impacts actually come under fire a lot over the last year or two. In fact, there's a big article, an outside of our lines thing on ESPN about impact and how it's maybe being used inappropriately to say, hey, Sasha passes impact, he's ready to go, when clearly you weren't. And so and the impact mechanism are the first guys to tell you, it's a piece of the puzzle. It's one of the tools that is used to decide, hey, you're ready to go or not. And I kind of have, I have this in there, and I wrote it in one more detail, but there's a lot of different pieces that you use, and honestly, the most important piece, if you've got a trustworthy athlete, is what they tell you. I mean, I have a lot of athletes that you do the exams, you do everything, and you're kind of on the fence saying, I think they're ready to go. And some of the athletes will say, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. And so there's a whole big piece of the puzzle. There's lots of different pieces that go into that.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And the way I would say it is maybe simpler is it's completely subjective.
Yeah.
I mean, it's completely subjective. There's no set, do this and you're good. I would agree that the athlete is the person who's got to tell you the problem right now. I think a lot of the times, well, not today, but as it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the problem is the athlete didn't want to say, right? When you think about boxing, right? It's a great analogy I've used before, but basically the definition of a concussion. It also is the sport where it says, hey, I didn't get big, you didn't get me, I'm not phased. It's the ego and everything else that goes into it. And so it's hard for, I think, athletes sometimes, especially at the professional level, to say, hey, I've got a concussion, I need to step out. The only thing that kept me from going back into basically clearance by the doctors and everything to go into it was the fact that I told them that I was still experiencing symptoms. Otherwise, I would have been cleared and I would have gone back into regular routines. So it really comes down to the individual to have to take care of themselves. And the biggest problem, I think, is that most people can't recognize all the symptoms. Yeah.
With your extent of your 4 years of recovery, how much do you attribute the extent of that being those 4 bad times of just keeping on efforts that you did over and over and over? Do you have that?
I think mine was a issue based on multiple concussions. I personally feel like it was just an accumulation over a long period of time of multiple things, which led to me being more maybe susceptible to certain factors. I don't know if there's history or research behind it that says, once you have 1 concussion and a second concussion, you're much more likely to have 3rd, 4th issues. What I do know is that after I had a concussion, I saw 3 neurologists. Immediately after I went to the University of California, Irvine, saw a specialist there. It took about 7 or 8 different tests. And then 2 months later, went to the University of California, Los Angeles, to their trauma center for oncology and neurology. And went through another bunch of tests. And one of the things that the doctor talked about, and it's probably some of the things that you face, things is like the car accidents, all that kind of stuff. But when they looked through the test, it said basically, everything that I was showing from symptoms-wise to testing showed that I was very similar to someone who had a car accident or a soldier who just returned and had like a blast go off next to him. But when I looked at the actual incident, when I compared it to other concussions that I've had, I don't think it would be rated as the top 4 of concussions. So it's really weird to tell what truly caused or what happened.
Well, one thing I would say, I was telling somebody this earlier, is this is what makes it so hard, is that it's such a wide range. I mean, I constantly had a conversation with a team physician like a month ago maybe, and we were saying it's so weird that sometimes you will see the hardest thing you've ever seen, and you can be lucky to replace it, and then the next week he's in the game. You see something that just looks so innocuous, just the silliest little thing, and they're out for years or careers, and it's just so weird. And it goes to show that I think everybody's a little bit different. So everybody's going to react.
Yeah, and just maybe to follow on your question, you talked about headers. I think headers, it's really interesting, right? Because I think a lot of people always hit second parents and all that kind of stuff. And Nick, you can jump in here. Because I think you're not very good at heading the ball. True statement. If you had the ball off your forehead, it feels a lot. I don't have an issue. I mean, I had never had any sort of problem ever. If I had the ball, it's coming 100 miles an hour in my head. As long as I hit it off my forehead, always fine. But if you hit it just above your forehead or just on top of your head, you'll get like a little bit of a, whoa, and then like 30 seconds later, okay, you're fine. Well, you tell me, is that a concussion or is it not a concussion, right? Very difficult to tell. You stand up, you're like, okay, I feel good, and now I'm ready to go. You don't see any problem. So I think that's the biggest gray areas, right? It's just you don't know truly what is and what's not. If it creates some sort of symptom and you feel like you're having an issue, then it probably is or could be a concussion. But again, I think those are the areas that it's so subjective, it's difficult to tell. Because one kid can take, the ball 100 miles up in the air, it comes down and hits him in the head. Maybe it feels weird to him, but the other kid can do the same thing. It's not. It's so difficult to pin down what is causing it. Or when it happens. I don't know if
everyone really that.
We'll take one more and then we'll let Dr.
The age of the athlete, that matter.
So there's a lot of debate about this, and I think what a lot of people think is that the age does matter to a degree, and part of it is we know younger kids. It sounds kind of weird. We can have bigger heads than not as strong men. Kind of the best analogy for it. So there's more movement there. So we think that's the reason that there's a little bit more susceptibility for younger kids. For sure. I mean, there's a lot of movement in the medical community to say, well, kids shouldn't be playing contact sports because of that. There's no real great research to back that up and say absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't want to give misinformation and stuff, but what we have looked at in the organization that we work with is it seems to be as kids younger are more susceptible, also from a brain development standpoint. Their brains are still developing and still trying to grow. So if they have an issue at a younger age, being more cautious with it and letting them fully recover before they have a second impact is very important.
You said something that visual athlete determine what it should go and not because of something. Would you say that more than anything else about this in here on in? I'm not feeling right, that's what you said.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example of mine. My career ended not because of my choice, right? My career ended because the team basically said, well, if you don't think you can play, I'm not going to keep you on my team. And I had to make a decision at that point, okay, do I think I want to go back in and put myself in a position where I don't think is right, or walk away at that point, right? And so absolutely it comes down to the individual to have to make the decision and say, is this the right thing I'm going to do? Unfortunately, I was got 10 years into a career. I knew my career was heading towards the down versus something up. But think about young kids who are trying to make it 22 or 23 professional sport, the kids in college who are trying to make it into professional games, and the younger kids who are trying to make it into college. I mean, you just look at everybody's trying to get to certain levels. And responsibility comes down to you. It's your body, you're the one who has to do it. Which is why I think the most important thing is educating people and understanding what the symptoms are and when the injury occurs, what potential causes of concussions could be. I think you got a very good question. It doesn't have to be a head injury, cause of concussion. So I think the more we can educate the kids about it, they can hopefully make that determination of whether or not they feel like they should. But it's a very difficult decision. Very difficult decision. Thank you for with us. So as you can see, Sasha likes to talk, and that's what he was a part of our players. See more talks over there. See, so this is kind of the fun banter that I'm missing the locker room with Sasha and some of the guys, and I was sad to see Sasha's career cut short. But like Sasha said, there are guys who it's your profession, it's your career, it's your livelihood. You've got a family, and to make that decision as a professional, I think it's sometimes more difficult, or can be more difficult, than a kid at a college or a high school level who's trying to make that next step. Lucky for Sasha at Brookside to actually do the right thing. And a lot of guys, a lot of women, a lot of athletes don't necessarily make that right choice. And they're gambling with their life, livelihood, and everything else they do with it. So it is a scary, real situation. Dr. Rippee, would you like to wrap it up here and ask we can leave, I guess, the rest for questions?
Yeah. Seriously, Sasha was probably better than I am. Still annoying as me instead. So some of this we actually got our see. This is why I said I'm boring. You get that real person that can put it in the real person words. I like to use all the doctor words. I mean, I spend a lot of money to learn how to use all these big words. I feel like I got to justify it. All right, so I wanted to start kind of this part with the myths and facts about concussion because there's a lot of these, and we hit on one that I didn't even have up here earlier. So I think this is one that I run into probably the most. The myth is, oh, I got a concussion. You got to wake them up. Don't let them sleep. If you let them sleep, bad things happen. It's the farthest thing from the truth. Okay? They actually need sleep. Let them sleep. Let them rest. Let them take a break. It's not a big deal. They're going to be fine. You want to keep an eye on them. Obviously, if they're having a lot of symptoms, you want to keep an eye on them. But you don't have to wake them up every 2-3 hours. I'd actually never heard the one about flying. I'm gonna put that one up here.
Yeah.
Sometime.
Yeah, it's interesting because actually that was so you talk about waking up every 2-3 hours. That night they woke me up every 2-3 hours.
Yeah. Which is horrible, right?
It was a long time ago. That was, I was thinking about it was like 15 years ago.
Yeah. You feel terrible when someone's waking you up every 2 hours. So as far as I know, and I tell my patients, if you want to fly, go for it. There's no the changes in cabin pressure and all that stuff is really not a big deal. So that's one of the myths I don't have.
How about after the injuries happen, and there's always been that about not letting them go to sleep or taking that right after the injury? Is there something to that too?
A lot of these, it's kind of like, some of them, I'm like, I have no clue where that came from, but it's just, that's what it was, that's how we did things 15 years ago, so that's how we do things 10 years later,
Is it more just on the fact that injury didn't find, like, someone goes to sleep or a football player passes out?
Yeah.
Is that the concept?
I think it's that fear, yeah, I think it's that fear that something bad is going to happen. You're going to go to wake them up in 2 hours and they're going to wake up. But there's actually there's no need to wake them up. So you shouldn't treat a headache from concussion. I get this one a lot too. The parents come in and say, I didn't give them any Tylenol, I didn't give them take some Tylenol or ibuprofen. It's not a big deal. I usually recommend Tylenol. There's a hint of some bleeding issues with ibuprofen and these kind of things, but with ibuprofen is what works. Let them take some ibuprofen. It's not a big deal. They'll be fine. They would rather have the ibuprofen than have their headache not nearly as bad as they would to not have anything. Children recover at the same rate as adults. We've kind of talked about this already. They actually tend to recover slower. It's that brain plasticity, that brain still in development
tends to take a little longer to recover. Or concussion requires loss of consciousness. We've talked about this one, right? I mean, it is not. Did you lose consciousness in yours? Yeah. So, concussion is not a brain injury. I talked about that a little earlier. I mean, I can't get. I have people that go, "Why are you seeing a neurologist for concussion?" It's a brain injury. There's lots of people that treat concussion, but I mean, neurology's kind of got this bad rap for concussion. I don't know why. But did you? Where was the third place you went? Just out of curiosity.
I'm sorry, doctor, two doctors, and the recommendation of doctor in Los Angeles.
Okay. I was just curious there. Okay, so we talked about this one. You need to be hit on. You guys are stealing my thunder, so you need to be hit on the head after concussion. You don't. No long-term effects from concussion. Not true. In fact, the vast majority of patients I see are continuing. I mean, the ones that are easier, the kids that come in and they get better 3 days later, you say, you clear them, and they never come back. Male and female athletes have the same chance of getting concussion. Not true. Like I think I said a little earlier, high school girls are actually have a higher incidence of concussion. I don't know why. And there's a lot of people trying to figure out why. Is it they're more aggressive? Is it they're less aggressive? Is it helmets? Is it technique? Is it just differences in body? I don't know. I will talk about this one later. This is a myth, though. The newest helmets prevent concussion. So, actually, I literally just read an article right before I came over here about it. This is my favorite myth. Oh, the athlete's going to tell you they have a concussion. Some of them will, and it's getting better. I don't know if, I mean, has anybody seen the studies about when they survey NFL football players about whether they say they have a concussion or not? Like 80% say, I would never tell them, ever, that I have a concussion. And if you watch them, they have to like take their helmet away. There's actually the new rule now is that they have to take them back to the locker room. They're not even allowed to be on the field. They have to get them out of that crowd environment because it's too noisy and those kind of things. So I'll talk. I have a story about it's called Freestone. It's about Jamal Charles. Actually, right now. Anybody watch this game? The worst game ever. Actually, it's not. There's like one in the many of the Chiefs' worst games ever. So I guess the first thing I would say is if you watch this hit, it's not necessarily the worst football hit you've ever seen, right? I mean, his head hits the ground, but how many times have you seen this where it's no big deal? So this was the playoff game. This is like 3 plays into the game. The team physician's one of our concussion physicians, and like, you're done. Sorry, you're out of the game. They took him back to the locker room. And that was the end of it. Because what you don't see in this clip, unfortunately, they stopped, is he doesn't actually get knocked out, but usually the first thing is they drop the football. If I see a football player drop the football, I'm like, I don't need anything else. They got a concussion. But when he gets up, he kind of stumbles around for just a second, and then he goes on the field. This is what I have to deal with. This was a quote from Jamal Charles like 3 weeks later. He said it on 610 Sports Radio, and then it made it into the newspaper. I was trying to get back on the field. The doctor said I had a concussion. I felt like I didn't have a concussion. I felt woozy like a boxer. You had a concussion, Jamal. Just give me the 10 count. Let me count to 10 and get back in the room and fight. I tried to talk my way back into the game, but it was national TV. They saw me get a little woozy. Once they saw that, they told me no. This is what we have to deal with. This is more common than look, I'm not ready to go back in. And this drove me nuts. I wanted to call up the team physician and be like, where's Jamal? I need to talk to this guy right now. I mean, you're killing me. It feels like you get these and it undoes every 10 lectures I feel like this. I go out and do 10 talks and then Jamal goes in the paper and says this, and it's like, oh, well, Jamal was fine. It wasn't really a concussion. His doctors were just being conservative. So this is kind of the prime. And it's not just football players. I mean, football players get the notorious rap for this, but pretty much any athlete, any sport you can think of, there's going to be athletes that say, I'm fine, don't worry about it. Or they don't say anything. All right, so diagnosis. So this
this is what I do when a patient comes to see me, and it goes back to that first slide. Most of the time, I can say concussion. I know it when I see it. It doesn't take me very long to figure it out for the most part, especially early on. It's later on when you get those symptoms that last a while, and I haven't seen anybody that gets closure. So the first thing I do is try to recognize the symptoms, and I go through this list and I say, do you have any of these symptoms? And actually, what they do is, I didn't do much. The checklist is there. I give them a checklist. I said, check it off. Tell me what symptoms you got, and then they actually get a score for it. So, I put this up there. There are a lot of people who want to do scans to figure out, oh, this person's got a concussion. I don't care what they say. This scan will tell me they got it. I don't know of a single scan yet that will do it. So patients come to me all the time. They're like, here's my CD from Olathe Medical Center over in Park Region, whatever, for my CAT scan. I'm like, congratulations, you didn't have a skull fracture, otherwise you'd still be in the hospital. You didn't have a bleed, otherwise you'd still be in the hospital. You probably had a concussion. So there's a lot of people, and I shouldn't talk badly about imaging because I have a study that just got funded that we're trying to find that, and it's not, so there's, I'll bore you with some geeky neurology stuff. There's anatomical imaging, which is, I look at the imaging and something that doesn't look right. Well, a lot of the focus now is on functional imaging. So you put them in the scanner, and then you give them a test. You give them an impact test or something else, and you make them do something, and you see how does that work compared to somebody who hasn't had a concussion, and when they do this exam, and how does it change? So that's kind of where the focus is now. It's more so not you get this imaging and say, oh, you've got this little spot on your MRI, and that's your concussion. It's how does your brain function? Okay, so nothing replaces the exam. This is what I do every day, regardless of what kind of patient I'm seeing. So they all get an exam. But this is kind of the basics of what I do. And say the basics, it's really not that basic, but it comes down to three kind of big categories. Symptoms. Symptoms is probably number one. If they've got any symptoms, I don't care what the rest of it shows. They're probably not ready to go back to play yet, for sure. But then they get a neurocognitive eval and physical balance exam. So this is the symptom checklist. You can't read it because it's way too small. But it's like headache, neck pain, nausea, dizziness, vomiting, blurred vision, balance problems, control memory, those kind of things. And what I ask them to do is the far left column is 0, which means I don't have it. And then they have to grade it 1 to 6. And so then I add it all up, and I think the top score is 122, something like that. And I use this every time they come in. Every time they come in, they get this. They do it at the end of the impact too, or at the beginning of the impact. They make you take this, and you use the score and say, hey, I just saw a girl today. Last time I saw her symptom score was 70. I see her today, and the first question I ask is, how are you doing? She says, I feel a lot better. And I say, let me see your symptom score. It's 11. It matches. And surprisingly, when you sit in front of somebody and ask them, do you have headache? Do you have this? The answers you get are, I get better answers off the sheet of paper than I get. Most athletes will actually be pretty forward with you on this. The other thing I tell them though is, I could take this some days and have 4 or 5 minutes of it. Okay.
I actually, very good point. I didn't talk about this before. I actually, after my injury, about 3.5 weeks after my injury, I started doing daily journals of that for the next 6 months. And it's very helpful. But like you said, some days crazier other days.
Yeah, it does. It'll fluctuate. And it'll depend. I had a patient, she was doing really well, and that she went to the movies on a Saturday, and I saw her on Monday, and I said, look, you look like you feel worse. Sometimes you can just tell. You walk in the room, and the lights are off, or they just look like terrible. And she filled out the symptom score, and it was like double. I said, what happened? She said, I went to the movie on Saturday. Okay. So anyways, I always forget the list of what you have to tell a teenager not to do. Just grow. They always find that one thing you didn't tell them to do. So then you have to, my list grows frequently. So then I do a balance test. This is a simple version. This is what I do. I don't have the fun tools, but you make them stand with their feet together, their hands on their hips, and their eyes closed. And you make them stand. I always ask them what foot would they kick the ball with. I make them stand on the other foot, hands on the hips, eyes closed. Disclaimer: I can't do it without making a couple of errors. So what I always tell them, if you're a gymnast who can stand on a balance beam this thick and do twirls and flips and stuff like that, you better be able to pass this test. If I've got a
a high school football player that's not that great, and he's like, look, I couldn't do some of this before I ever got hit on the head. So you score this and take it with a little bit of grain of salt, but you want to see, ideally, everything kind of goes back to the baseline. I mean, you want to know, ideally, how's their balance before they ever got hit on the head, and then you can compare it. But it's just not feasible, to be honest. Then the last thing is I have them stand 1 foot in front of the other, eyes closed, and you do it for 20 seconds each. You count how many airs they get, and you score it. And so you watch this thing, does the score go up or down or stay the same? Are they getting better or worse? These are the fun tools. These are Biodex, and I forget the name of the other one, but anyways, it's the same thing, but it's a way to measure the balance. What I actually think is cooler, and I think more applicable, because you can't wheel that thing to the sideline and check somebody's balance, is now they're making apps for the iPhone, and they just take the iPhone, they do the same poses, they hold it right there, they strap it to their chest, and they can use the accelerometer to measure how much they sway in any one direction. And then it spits out this, it has some computer algorithm calculation, and it spits out this report. And so you can use that. It's a little more practical for somebody on the sideline to have an iPhone and say, hey, I've got this app, let's check your balance. So this is what Sasha was talking about. Honestly, this is probably the #1 thing I see, diagnose, and treat is it's called the vestibular ocular system. So the vestibular apparatus is what most people call the inner ear. It's what tells your brain where your head's at, and it's pretty sensitive to get knocked around. It also has a connection with your eyes, and so this system, this wiring system, the whole point is to make everything smooth and coordinated. And so when it gets out of control, you can get these weird eye movements, and you can get these weird visual symptoms. The way I explain it is, anybody read in a car, either now or when they were a kid? Okay. So anybody get a headache when they read in the car for too long? Okay. So here's why. It's this system. And so it makes sense when you start to think about it, about why, if the system gets knocked out of control, why you get these nasty headaches and dizziness and all that stuff. So when you're just sitting here reading, everything's not moving, right? You're just holding the book, everything's stable. All you have to do is move your eyes along the book. When you're in a car, the car is bouncing up and down, you're bouncing up and down, the book's moving, and your brain and this system is trying to focus everything on that page. And it can do it for a while, but eventually it gets overwhelmed and you get symptoms, whether it's a headache or feel sick to your stomach or whatever it is. So imagine if this system is just out of control right out of the gate from a head injury. You just feel terrible no matter what you do, whether you're driving down the street trying to read a book. So this is probably the #1 thing I do, and this is I spend a lot of time on the eye exam. I don't even have the fun tools like the therapists that get to put their goggles on and make them shake their heads and turn the lights off and look for all the fun stuff that way. But I have some just kind of general tests that I can pick up, and if you spend a lot of time on this, you'll find almost, I don't have a number, a large portion of my patients have some abnormality here that generally responsible to treatment. Then of course they get the memory test. My favorite, remember these words, that I get every day and I can't remember. But it's, here's your words, repeat them back to me, here's your words, repeat them back to me. Then you do a whole bunch of other stuff, check their eyes, and then ask them for the words back. They get points for how many correct responses they get. Actually, maybe I did. Yeah, I did. And then you do what we call a concentration, attention, whatever you want to call it. You give them these numbers forwards and tell them to recite them backwards. Again, sometimes on my best day I can't do 6 numbers backwards, but and they get points for how many they get right. This is kind of the hot topic. Everybody wants to know, what's that test that I can check to make sure that they're better or worse or the same. Impact is probably the #1. That's probably the most widely used. These guys, the guys that created this are at Pittsburgh. They're the kind of the gurus behind this and started the whole field of neurocognitive testing. There's other ones, Axon Sports, Headminder. Again, the ideal is that you've got a baseline. All the pro leagues, almost all the colleges require their athletes to take these baseline tests. So they've got the money to spend. They can spend the money on this. It's when you get into the high schools and the junior highs and the club teams that you run into people who don't have impact baseline testing or whatever. You can get around it, but the best way to use the information is if they've got a baseline to compare and say, here's where you were before you got hit in the head, and here's where you are after you get hit in the head. But you work what you get. And so, but again, it's a piece of the puzzle. So all of this is, they can pass the impact, you know, their visual exam looks great, but their symptom score stinks. They're not ready to go back. I don't need to tell you about the impact. Sasha explained it pretty well. It's a hard test. But I hate the squiggly line one. That is because they'll give you the right squiggly line, but they'll turn it like 90 degrees. Yeah, and you're like, oh yeah, I saw that one. Sorry, you missed it. And then they have all these funky mathematics they can do. You can tell, like, is the guy going really slow to make sure he got all the right answers, or is he just going really fast? Answers be damned, just to make sure you got the speed scores right. And there's always the argument of, well, you know, he's going to sandbag at the beginning of the season so that when he gets hit later on and his scores stink, they go, oh, it looks the same. And so they claim you can tease that out. I don't know how accurate that is, but you know, they claim that they can tease out those people who are trying to sandbag it. Sometimes you can't. I mean, sometimes it's really obvious, but so again, it's why it's just a piece of the puzzle. All right, so what do you do? I mean, somebody asked, what do you do? Honestly, the number one thing I tell them is take a break. It's really easy to tell an athlete, hey, you sprained your ankle, you broke an arm. Sorry, you're just gonna have to rest until it gets better. That kind of somehow people get that, you know, they can see the injury or whatever, they can feel the injury. This one's a lot harder, especially when you're dealing with. Read this list and tell me how many teenagers want to do this. Avoid texting, TVs, movies. I basically tell them anything that's got a screen on it, sorry, you're done. It's going to make your symptoms worse. You know, noisy, bright light. This true story. So my concussion coordinator, she's the nurse who kind of filters everything out. She was one of my patients. When was NSYNC here? 6 months ago, 9 months ago. She comes in, she's like, I have front row tickets to the NSYNC concert tomorrow. I'm like, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I'm just telling you, bright lights, loud, noisy situation. She's like, I'm going. Okay. She comes back the next day. She's like, that was the worst concert ever. I don't know why I did that. So anyways, lots of times I'll give kids a day off school or a couple days off school. Don't go to school. When you think about school, passing periods, there's hundreds of kids in the hallway, lunch period. I mean, it's just a loud, noisy place. Not to mention the fact that they actually have to tax their brain and do work. So I'll give them, I'll either say take some time off school, or you get early passing periods, or you can eat lunch in a quiet place, or whatever the case might be. Regular sleep time, just make sure you're going, you know, you're not off school and getting to stay up till midnight and sleep till noon the next day. You got to stay in this kind of regular cycle, and then no driving. Just try to hate that too. These are a lot of the things I do. The number one thing I do is vestibular rehabilitation. This is that. What they do is they work on that dizziness and that balance and those eye movements. These are my best friends in the world. I love, my vestibular therapist move, I'm screwed. I'm going with them wherever they go. And if I move, I'm taking them with me. A good vestibular therapist goes a long way towards treating this. Probably the number two thing I do is the cervical spine exam and treatment. Did you have any of that? I mean, yeah.
There's also one at the top of it. Do the test where you try your inner ear, the fibers inside of your wrist, they try to like
turn you around upside down and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and try to rebalance it.
Yeah.
And see that helps.
So probably the number two thing I find, especially if they complain a lot of headaches, that you just can't get rid of. They've done vestibular, they've done all this other stuff. You can't get rid of their headaches. I'll send them for a spine exam. Anybody hockey fans? Sidney Crosby, he's like the golden boy of hockey right now. He had a concussion that he just could not kick. It was that same kind of thing. He kept going back and getting these weird symptoms and just couldn't quite get through that wall. And they finally took him to a guy who does cervical therapy. And after, I don't remember how long he got treated, but he eventually got better and started playing again. So I have a lot of patients that get cervical therapy and do really well too. One thing I actually didn't put up there, which sounds a little bit like you did it, is kind of some specific sport training, that heart rate. I was just like sitting there shaking my head. I've got a lot of patients who tell me they kind of get there and then they hit that wall and they just can't break through that wall. And so what we do is we take that and just break it down into little baby steps and just kind of gradually try to increase and push that wall up higher until eventually it's not an issue. And a lot of my physical therapists will do that. Yeah.
Are the headaches, I know it's different for everybody, but are the headaches localized to one part of the brain, like the left, right, back?
Some people tell me, some people will say it hurts right where I hit my head. Other people, it's just the whole head, it's a pressure, sometimes it's in the back. The thing that tips me off sometimes is if it's in the back, it feels like a pressure that might be something with their neck. A lot of times it's really vague and it just is all over the map.
But generally, there is the whole head, the whole headache is.
I'd say it's probably,
not localized.
yeah, it's everybody's a little different.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Yeah. Neuropsychological testing, it sounds like a big bad word. It's basically a monster impact test where you for 3 hours. Vision therapy, and then actually the last thing I use is medications. Because really the medication is just trying to cover up that symptom, or at least make them feel better so they can get to physical therapy and feel better and go through it. But I'm not a big pill pusher by any stretch of the imagination, because it usually is just covering up the symptoms.
So yeah, I never use medication, but what I heard is that medication, there's a lot of people who have side effects from it.
Yeah, that's the #1 reason I don't use it. Because so like from a boring neurologist perspective, we have all these different medications we use for chronic headaches. The problem is, if I run down the most common ones, sleepiness is the biggest side effect, which actually is probably the one I use the most just because it's the least out of all of them. Dizziness, put a dizzy patient on a pill that's going to make them dizzy, that's no good. And then the other two I use, it's big memory problems, fogginess. It's pretty much all my patients. So I try to avoid those medications. Sometimes you get to their end of the rope and they're like, God, I got to try something. So we'll try them. But the one thing I'll say that there's some interesting kind of research and theories behind some medications for the cognitive side effects, the memory, the fogginess, the attention. And there's some people who are using some of the ADHD stimulant medications like Rippee and those types of medications. I don't like to get into those because they come with a lot of other issues, but there's a lot of data starting to come out about some other medications that may help with that. So those are probably where I use medications the most, is those patients that just are really foggy and can't get over their cognitive side. Okay, return to life. Am I doing okay on time? I don't know. Okay, so they got to have a normal exam. Balance, cognition, the whole thing's got to be normal. They've got to be symptom-free. Sometimes you can skirt around that and say, look, I had headaches before, I've got a little bit of headache, it's like it was before, but it's not the headaches I had with my concussion. But generally, they've got to be completely symptom-free, and their impact or whatever cognitive testing you do has to be based on that. That's when you start these protocols. And so there's some, a lot of people, this is becoming fairly standardized. So they start, the first thing they say, especially if you're talking about high school, they got to go back to school. If they're not in school, they don't need to play soccer, they don't need to play football. If they can't go to school, they can't play sports. So you start out, they stay home. The next thing is you let them do some homework for about 30 minutes. Then you send them back to school for part-time. You let them get passing periods, a whole bunch of accommodations. Then you let them go back to school. You start peeling accommodations away, and eventually you say, okay, you're back in school full-time. So yeah, they got to go back to school first. The next one is the return to play, and generically you can do this step one step every day. People are slower. It might take 4 years to get through this step, and you may have to break these steps down into smaller steps and gradually increase. But generally, what we say, the first step, once you're cleared, symptom-free, go back to play. If you get to do some light exercise, walking, riding a stationary bike, maybe jogging for about 10 minutes. Then you slowly build that up and say, okay, the next day, if you're symptom-free, you can do 30 minutes of a little bit of running. If you're symptom-free, the next day you can do some weight training. The next day, if you're symptom-free, then you can start wearing equipment, helmets, pads, whatever. Go back to practice. And then if they're symptom-free, they get to play. This is hard. Again, this is hard for the coaches. This is why I think it should be monitored by physicians or somebody who's maybe not as involved with the team. Because I had a coach call me, I had a kid on step 4. He goes, hey, we just finished practice. We made a special practice for him so they can be cleared because we've got a game in 30 minutes. 24 hours, sorry, you can play tomorrow. There's a lot of, and the NFL is very strict about this. This is, if they get hit on Sunday and they've got a Thursday night game, there's no way they're going to make it through all 5 steps by Thursday night, so they're not going to play. I mean, Wes Welker with the Broncos had an injury, and I'm like, he's not going to play. They had a Thursday game, I'm like, he's not going to play. I told my wife, or I told my fantasy football buddies, I'm like, whoever's got Welker might as well sit him because he's not playing. And then they need, preferably the final clearance comes from somebody who's appropriately trained to treat this. And so this is where those state laws come in. I think it's actually 50 out of 50 now. I think Mississippi is finally passed that legislation. This is the Kansas law. This is what it says. Concussion education has to be given to coach. This is only for high school. This does not apply to club teams. This does not apply to junior high or college. This is only for high school, which I think is probably going to change, and regardless of whether it actually applies to a club team, I think it should be followed. At least in good practice, that would be the way to do it. There has to be education for coaches, athletes, parents, guardians. I would extend that to referees, anybody that's at the game. I think we like the idea of referees too. I mean, they're kind of the impartial judge that can say, look, I don't care if this is LeBron James or the last guy on the bench or whoever, that they're done. They're out of the game. There's got to be a signed release form by the parent or guardian each year. Athletes have to be removed immediately if they suspect a concussion. And a healthcare provider, either an MD or a DO, has to clear them before written clearance. There has to be a form signed that says they're clear to go back to play. Is anybody a chiropractor? Anybody's loved one a chiropractor? Okay. If so, I don't mean this offensively, but this law is actually being passed around in the state legislature for revision because chiropractors want to clear athletes. I actually think this law is too broad. Anybody with a license can clear these kids, even if they're like, I don't even know what a concussion is, but I do have my MD, so here you go, feel free to go back to play. So anyways, they're trying to broaden it. This is the Missouri law. They made a fancy name for it. It's basically the same until you get to the end, and they just say a licensed healthcare provider. And this is where the Kansas chiropractors are going, hey, if I go across the state line in my chiropractor, I can clear a kid from Independence, but I can't clear a kid from Olathe. And so and most of the state laws are the same. There's a little variation on the theme. All right, so how long does it take to recover? 3 days, 4 years? I don't know. Everybody's a little different. This is generally what I tell patients. Within 4 weeks, 95% of patients are better, whether you do anything or not, whether they just sit at home and rest, or whether they get vestibular therapy or not. 95% of them are better. It's those last 5% that linger out there, and unfortunately tend to have the worst outcomes. So why do other people why do some people take longer than others to recover? I don't know. There's a lot of theories: age, gender, repetitive concussion. There's something that suggests migraine history or migraine symptoms may mean they're going to take longer to recover. There's also some people that say if they have that foggy feeling, they're more likely to take longer to recover. So this is called post-concussion syndrome. I usually say after 4 weeks, it's post-concussion syndrome, not concussion syndrome. And so I'll go through this real quick and then I'll tell a story. Symptoms, they may last 3 to 6 months, sometimes years. The cause is unknown, we don't know why. We think there may be a pre-existing, we think it may be they've had a bunch of concussions, but we don't really know. Right, mostly you treat them symptomatically: sleep, nutrition, chronic pain, psychiatric, whatever they need. What I will see sometimes though is that patient who's 6 months from their injury and they say, I feel terrible, and I say, what has somebody done for you? And they say, nothing. I've just been suffering for 6 months. You do the exam, they've got horrible eye movements, and you send them to a vestibular therapist and they're great. It tends to take a little longer than somebody you catch earlier. Those are my favorite patients. I love those because those are the patients that are desperate for something because they just felt ill forever and no one's done anything for them. Okay, so my story, I have a patient who is a high school basketball player. She's been in the newspaper. I'm not going to tell you her name because I don't think I'm allowed to, but she was playing basketball, got hit during the game, was out, I think 2 weeks, and she told me she'd seen 4 or 5 other physicians by the time she came to see me, and she said, the first physician I saw, I lied to him. I told him I didn't have any symptoms. I was able to write down words that he made me memorize, and when I went back to him, he made me recite the same words, which I spent 2 weeks memorizing. And so he cleared me. She went back to play, first game back, she falls, she gets hit. She's been a mess ever since. She's better. She's going on 2 years now. She's better with some treatment, but she's by no means completely healed. God bless her though, she's actually started her own foundation called the Heads Up Foundation. She held a fundraising trail run in November and raised $10,000, which she's getting ready to give out grant awards for research and education. So unfortunately, there's a lot of these patients, and I tend to see a lot of them because they've tried everything, and eventually they make it to our clinic. And sometimes we can help them, and sometimes we can't. My favorite is not to give up on them, though, because 4 years down the road, they might at least be better. Again, they may not be completely better, but they can at least function in a way that they feel comfortable and feel good about. So, anybody want to talk about this? I want to skip this. I hate this section. But I'll talk about it if somebody wants to talk about it. It's chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This is the hot topic in the NFL right now. It's probably going to be a hot topic everywhere eventually. But this is basically what we worry about with the prolonged, repetitive concussions, and it looks a lot like Alzheimer's. That's the gist. I won't bore you. Okay, concussion prevention. I promise I'll wrap up here in just a couple minutes. Okay, so the number one things I tell people: how do you prevent a concussion? So you want the proper equipment. You want I put taxing. Hopefully not tackling that much in soccer, but I know it happens. So, proper technique. You want the proper fit of the equipment. So if you got a football player whose helmet's either too loose or too tight, it's not going to work. Awareness and education. They've got. I mean, I like your. They've got to be, what is it, prevention, diagnosis, and treatment, right? I mean, that's the basic gist of it. But if you can get baseline testing, there's a lot of new grants coming out for schools to say, hey, we're going to give you $20,000 to test all your athletes. Or there's companies that are saying, look, we'll do it for free. Or we'll do it for free for 2 years, and then you've got to buy our product. But, removal from play when they get hit, and appropriate treatment. Okay, so helmets. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Are you advocating about the mirror?
I have a picture of that somewhere. No, I don't. Actually, yeah, it's down here in the left corner. So here's my theory on helmets. Anybody watch my 10-second spiel on the news this morning? It was like 5 o'clock in the morning. I don't blame you. I wasn't up either. So here's a little bit of history on helmets. They were actually invented to prevent skull fracture, and they don't do a lot for concussion. It goes back to that brain inside of a hard box. The brain sloshing around inside of a hard box. The helmets will dissipate some of that energy. So if you've got some of the smaller blows, the helmets may help with that, but in general, you don't have to. It can be a complete change in direction, and the brain smacks into the side of the skull. So I don't know how everybody else is feeling on the soccer ones. When I have parents who say, "Hey, I want to spend a lot of money on a headgear, whether it's a football helmet, a baseball helmet, a soccer headgear," I usually say, "If you want to, that's fine. The data doesn't support it." So that's my spiel. I actually just read an article on the way over here that says it was an NFL study that they took the 10 most popular helmets and they only reduced the risk of concussion by 20%. It's not it's 20%, but that's versus not wearing a helmet and playing football. So
take that for what you will. So the helmets help. I mean, if I got a kid riding a bike, wear your helmet. Please wear your helmet. If they're skateboarding, wear your helmet. If you're playing football, wear your helmet. But really, you're trying to prevent skull fractures and more really severe bleeding and swelling and damage like that. As for the concussions, it helps, but it's by no means a complete fix. And it's the same way, like I was talking to the team physician for the Royals the other day, and he said, these new helmets or hats for the pitchers so that they don't get hit by a line drive and get concussions. Like it's a complete joke. It's not going to work. If they get hit hard enough, they're going to get hurt. So,
Dr. Rippee, can you talk a little bit maybe about dental appliances, specifically like custom-made mouth guards?
Yeah, and I should probably let you talk about it more than me, but so it's kind of the same concept. There is some protection and there's some, but it's not. Again, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I don't tell my patients to spend. Would you tell me how much it was? Yeah, so I was like, I usually say I wouldn't spend the money. If you want to do it, but I usually say there's not a great amount of data right now that says it's helpful. That it's, if you wear a mouth guard, you're never going to get a concussion. So, the equipment is, there's no real good equipment right now to say this is how you're going to prevent a concussion. I like this picture. This is Andy Reid before he was a chief, and Michael Vick, and just I usually tell parents, I'm like, unless you can bubble wrap their brain, the helmets are going to help, but they're not going to completely get rid of the risk. So these are the new baseball ones. Yeah, they look kind of stupid, don't they? Age, I talked about, but that's pretty much it. Any questions? Sorry, that took longer than that. If you have a shameless plug, if you have a concussion, yeah.
What's is there a current level of sports with the baseline testing as far as in high school yet?
I would say college is the most the lowest level that's the most consistent. There's high schools in the Kansas City area that baseline test. Most of them, they baseline test certain sports. You might do football, you might do soccer. But again, if it comes to a money, if you go to the school board and say, we want to spend thousands of dollars to baseline test our athletes, they say, no thanks. So,
is there any, like, with Kansas and all 50 states not having laws, are they going to push that into the high school? I
don't see it, partly because it's a monetary issue, and I think if they try to legislate it, someone's going to eventually say, well, who's going to pay for it? The argument of who pays for it. But and I think part of it is, like we were saying, it's one of the pieces of the puzzle. And honestly, you can get by without it. I don't have, not every one of my patients takes the impact test, whether they've had a baseline or not. And so you can get by without it. So I would say probably not. I think it's an important piece, especially like I don't routinely do impact tests on a 45-year-old businessman who got in a car accident. Sometimes I will if I think it's going to help me. I find it more helpful for the athletes, and especially if they've got a baseline. But I still don't think it's going to be. I would love to see it widespread, but I don't think it's going to end up extremely widespread. So. Yeah.
Just kind of from a logistical standpoint, so it's a Saturday, and you suspect maybe your kid has a possible concussion in the soccer game or basketball game. Do you go to the emergency room right after the game? Do you then follow up with a neurologist on Monday? What are the kind of the logistics?
Yeah, so usually most patients end up going through the ER. So we have a number that you can call us. It's usually only answered Monday through Friday. And we do have, and some other places have this where you can call a certain referral line and they will forward it on, but it still may not get answered until Monday. Our goal, and again, it's hard. I mean, we're talking how many soccer games are going on a Saturday in the metro area, or during football season. Our volumes kind of spike with the sports seasons, and so you can't have a physician at every sporting event. It's just not possible. And so generally, I say go to the ER, and then I usually say if you can be seen within 48 hours, which even if they get hurt on a Friday, you can usually make it till Monday morning. That's usually pretty adequate. So. Thanks for having me. Sorry.
So thanks everybody for spending the night here with us. You know, if you do have further questions for Dr. Rippee or for Sasha, I'll stick around in the next 5 or so minutes. So feel free to walk up to them and ask them any question that wasn't answered. You know, I do appreciate your time and coming out and better educating us as a soccer community. You know, we're not all tied to Brookside soccer, but you know, there's a passion there for the kids and education. So, Sasha, great job on your part. I do appreciate it. Lance Osborne here in the back and his wife Annie, who's helped put this together. I do appreciate them. So, and thank you very much for your time. And feel free to ask more. Thank you. I didn't